Chapter 1. The examination chamber smelled of dried lavender and damp stone and something else. Something sharp and medicinal that Sera associated with bad news. She had been in this room twice before. Once when her father died. Once when she miscarried at 7 weeks alone, before she'd told anyone she was even hoping. Both times, Healer Voss had delivered the news from behind his work table, his back half-turned, his voice professionally flat. A man who had learned long ago that distance made the hard things easier. He was doing it again now. The scratch of his quill against parchment had been the only sound in the room for 4 full minutes. Sera had counted. She'd stared at the rain-streaked window, watching lightning flicker over the mountains, and she had counted every second. "Healer Voss," she finally said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was grateful for that, at least. "Whatever it is, just say it." The quill stopped. Voss set it down. He didn't turn around immediately. She watched his shoulders, thin, stooped with age, rise and fall in the breath of a man preparing himself. "My Luna," he said to the wall. "I have run the blood tests twice. I consulted the moon charts going back 18 months. I even called in Mira from the Eastern Keep to cast a second opinion. And," he turned then. His face was the practiced mask of a man who had learned not to cry in front of patients. But his eyes, old gray, tired, slid away from hers the moment they met. "Your womb is what we call," he paused, searching for the gentler word. There wasn't one. "Closed, my Luna. The life thread cannot anchor. Your body does not allow it to take root." Sera heard the words. She felt them land somewhere behind her sternum, neat and precise as an arrow finding the center of a target. "There are new techniques," she said. Her voice was very calm. She found that strange, even as it was happening. "Mira has spoken about the Eastern methods, the moon water treatments, the root tinctures. We tried them." Voss finally looked at her, and the apology in his expression was so immense it almost made her pity him. "For 6 months we tried them, Sera. The results do not change." There it was. The name, not the title. Healers only used your name when the news was beyond the reach of rank and ceremony. Sera, not my Luna, not your grace. Just Sera, a woman, sitting alone on a cold table in the rain. "There is something else," Voss said. He was picking up his quill again, setting it down, picking it up. A nervous habit she had never noticed in 15 years of knowing him. "There is something I must tell you before." The door opened. Not politely. Not with a knock. It opened the way doors open when the person behind them has decided that waiting is for other people. Alpha Ryker Ashvane stood in the doorway. He was by every physical measure extraordinary. Broad-shouldered and tall, with dark auburn hair and the kind of commanding stillness that made rooms go quiet. He had been the most dominant alpha in the Ironmark bloodline in 4 generations. He'd won the territorial war at 23. He'd held the northern border through 3 brutal winters. He was also, Sera had recently come to understand, capable of a cruelty so quiet and so practiced that it barely made a sound. Behind him, half hidden in the shadow of the doorway, wearing a pale blue gown that was almost deliberately bridal in its softness, stood Nadia, Sera's cousin. Ryker didn't look at her. He looked at Voss. "Well," Ryker said. Voss bowed his head. "It is confirmed, Alpha." Ryker's jaw tightened. It was the only movement on his face. "Confirmed as I suspected?" "Yes, Alpha." Sera slid off the examination table. Her legs held. She was proud of that. "You were listening," she said. It wasn't a question. Ryker turned to her then. He looked at her the way you looked at a door that had been useful for years and had finally, definitively, warped in its frame. "I needed to know," he said, "before tonight." "Before tonight," she repeated. "The solstice gathering. The northern packs will be there. There are things," he stopped. He looked at Nadia, and something passed between them, private, practiced, already decided. "There are things that need to be announced." Sera looked at her cousin. Nadia looked at the floor. "What things?" Sera asked. The silence before his answer was exactly 3 seconds long. She would remember those 3 seconds for the rest of her life. Chapter 2. The 3 seconds ended. "I have called a solstice assembly," Ryker said. His voice was the voice he used for pack announcements, broad, carrying final. "Tonight I will address the Northern Alphas. I will address our pack. And I will make a formal declaration regarding the Luna seat." Sera went very still. "The Luna seat," she said. "A pack without a Luna airline is a pack with a cracked foundation." Ryker moved into the room, and the space seemed to shrink around him the way it always did. The particular quality of his presence that had once made her feel safe and now made her feel cornered. "You know this. You have always known this." "I am your mate," Sera said. The words came out quiet and precise. "I am your bonded mate, Ryker. The moon sealed that. The blood ritual sealed that. You cannot simply." "I can restructure the Luna appointment," he said. "The High Elder has already confirmed the precedent. In cases where the Luna bond fails to produce." "The bond did not fail," Sera said, and her voice finally cracked, not in grief but in anger. Hot and sudden, like a fault line giving way. "I did not fail the bond. My body. Your body is the bond, Sera." His voice wasn't cruel. That was almost the worst part. It was patient. The tone of a man explaining something to someone who was being unnecessarily slow. "A Luna's purpose is the continuation of the bloodline. That is not my law. That is the law of every pack since the first wolf ever ran beneath the first moon." "You practiced that speech," she said. "Didn't you?" He didn't answer. Sera looked at Nadia again. Her cousin had still not raised her eyes from the floor. She was holding her hands clasped in front of her. The way you held your hands when you were trying very hard to look small and sorry when the truth was that you'd made your decision long before you walked into this room. "How long?" Sera asked her. Nadia's fingers tightened. "Nadia. For months." The words were barely a sound. For months. The autumn. While Sera had been hosting the harvest delegation. While she'd been managing the eastern border negotiations alone because Ryker had claimed the headaches were keeping him from the table. While she'd been sitting across from Healer Voss for round after round of treatments, hoping, measuring, counting. Nadia had been here. "She carries my heir," Ryker said. He put it plainly, the way you stated weather or distance. "It is confirmed. 11 weeks. The room spun, gently, like a compass losing its north. "Look at me," Sera said to her cousin. "At least look at me." Nadia looked up. Her eyes were wet. Whether from guilt or performance, Sera couldn't tell anymore. She wasn't sure she'd ever been able to tell. That was the thing about people you'd trusted absolutely. The betrayal rewrote every memory with a different light. Every kindness became a calculation. Every moment of closeness became a tactic. "I'm sorry," Nadia whispered. "No, you're not," Sera said. And it wasn't even an accusation. It was just true. "Tonight," Ryker said, stepping between them the way you stepped between two elements you didn't want combining, "I will make the announcement at the gathering. The pack deserves to hear it formally. You will be present." He looked at her dress, the deep gray ceremonial gown she'd worn for what she'd thought was a hopeful occasion. "Wear the white, the bonding white. I want the transition to be dignified," Sera said. The word tasted like iron filings. "Yes." He said it without irony, without a flicker of awareness that he was asking her to dress in the clothes of their union in order to publicly dissolve it. "The guest chamber in the East Wing has been prepared. Voss will make sure you have what you need." He turned to leave. "Ryker." He paused at the door, but didn't turn around. "You were the one who was always afraid," Sera said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "Not of battles. Not of rival alphas. You were afraid that you weren't enough. That your bloodline wasn't strong enough. That you would be the link in the chain that broke." She paused. "I knew that about you. I loved you with that." He stood still for a moment that was just long enough to wonder. Then he walked out. Nadia lingered 2 seconds longer. She opened her mouth once, closed it. Then she followed him. Sera stood alone in the lavender and rain smell of the healer's chamber. She placed one hand flat against her own stomach. Below her palm, so faint she might have imagined it, so quiet it might have been a wish, something moved. She didn't move her hand. She breathed. 3, she thought, without knowing where the thought came from, or why it arrived not as a question but as a certainty. 3. Chapter 3. The East Wing guest chamber was smaller than it sounded. It was a room for visiting dignitaries. People important enough to deserve stone walls and a real bed, but not important enough to deserve a fire already lit. Sera stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the narrow window, the thin wool blanket folded at the foot of the mattress, the single tallow candle on the writing desk. On the bed lay the white bonding dress. Of course it did. She crossed the room and picked it up, held it at arm's length. It was beautiful still. Ivory silk with silver thread worked through the collar and cuffs, the kind of dress that had taken 3 women 6 weeks to make. She had worn it on the night of the blood moon bonding. She had wept in it from joy, while Ryker pressed his thumb to the scar on her wrist and made promises in front of 300 witnesses. She set it back down. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put both hands on her stomach. In the healing chamber, she had told herself it was imagination. The flutter, the warmth, the particular quality of the nausea that had been waking her before dawn for 3 weeks. Not the sour rolling sickness of anxiety, but something deeper, more cellular, as though her body were quietly reorganizing itself around a new priority. She had wanted it to be real. She'd known, therefore, not to trust the wanting. But the wanting and the knowing were two different things, and they lived in two different parts of her. And right now, sitting alone in a cold room with the rain still hammering the keep and the white dress pooled beside her like a shed skin, she pressed her palms flat and she listened. Thrum, thrum, thrum. Not her own heartbeat. She knew her own heartbeat. This was thrum, thrum, thrum. 3 rhythms. Staggered. Distinct. Like 3 small drums played by 3 small musicians who hadn't yet learned to keep the same time. Sera stopped breathing. She had been in this room before. Not this room, but this moment. The moment of knowing something enormous before you were ready to know it. Her father's death. The miscarriage. The look on Nadia's face tonight before she'd raised her eyes from the floor. She knew what it felt like when the world cracked open. This felt different. This felt like something arriving. You're hiding, she whispered. The 3 rhythms pulsed together once, synchronized, just for a second, and then fell back into their staggered drumming. You felt something wrong in this place, Sera said. Her voice was barely sound. Didn't you? You know who he is. The warmth spread then, slow and golden, starting from her core and moving outward along her ribs like sunlight finding gaps in stone. Voss had lied. She was certain of it now, in the way she'd learned over the years to be certain of things she couldn't yet prove. Ryker had needed her to be barren. He had needed a reason that wasn't him. A justification for what he and Nadia had already built together in the dark. A clean story for the pack. A medical verdict that made her the broken one. So he could stand at the solstice gathering looking like a man making a necessary and painful decision rather than a man who had simply chosen convenience over vows. If she walked into that hall tonight and announced a pregnancy, he would call it a lie. Or worse, Nadia, who had been studying the dark herb arts since she was a girl, who kept a locked box under her sleeping chamber floor that Sera had been too trusting to ever ask about. Nadia would make sure the pregnancy ended before it could be verified. She could not be loud about this. She had to be silent. She had to get out. Sera stood. She looked at the white dress. Then she crossed to the wardrobe and opened it. Whoever had packed her things had included, thank the moon, her traveling leathers. Dark brown, worn soft, good boots. The clothes of a woman who could move. She dressed quickly. She braided her hair back. She looked once in the small bronze mirror above the washing basin. The woman looking back at her was pale, hollow-eyed. She looked like someone who had been standing on a cliff without knowing it and had just looked down. But her jaw was set. And her eyes were the eyes of someone who had just decided something. The bells of Ironmark began to toll. Dong, dong, dong. 7 strokes. The gathering would begin in 1 hour. Sera didn't go to the gathering. She went to the window. 3rd floor, east wing, overlooking the kitchen garden. The drop was 15 feet onto soft earth. She'd done worse in training. She opened the latch. She looked once at the white dress on the bed, at the empty shape of the woman she was supposed to be tonight, and then she climbed out the window and dropped into the dark. Chapter 4. The rain had eased to a cold mist by the time Sera cleared the outer wall. She moved through the kitchen garden, past the herb rows and the frost-blackened squash vines, staying low, staying close to the stone. The guard rotation at the east gate changed on the hour. She had managed that rotation herself for 4 years, which meant she knew exactly which 12 minutes belonged to no one. She took them. The forest beyond the keep's outer wall was old growth. Black pine and silver birch packed so densely the mist gathered between the trunks like something living. She ran. Not the panicked run of a woman fleeing, but the long, ground-eating stride of a trained she-wolf who had once placed second in the Ironmark trials and would have placed first if the judge hadn't been Ryker's uncle. She ran until the bells of the keep were swallowed by distance and pine. Then she stopped, put her hands on her knees, breathed. The cold air was a shock after the stuffy warmth of the keep. It tasted of pine resin and wet earth and something underneath both of those. Something mineral and ancient, like stone that had been wet for 1,000 years. The Ashfeld Barrens. She hadn't intended to come this direction. She'd told herself she was heading for the crossroads, the way station 3 miles east where the traveling merchants sheltered, where she might find food and a horse and some version of a plan. But her feet had brought her here instead. The barrens were not technically forbidden. There was no law that named them. There was simply a shared understanding. The kind of understanding that doesn't need to be written down, because everyone who grows up near a place learns its nature by osmosis. The barrens were wrong in some fundamental way, that wolves felt in their spines before they felt it anywhere else. The ground here was pale gray. Not snow. The temperature wasn't quite cold enough for snow. More like ash. As though something had burned here so long ago that the land had forgotten fire and simply kept the color. Nothing grew in the Ashfeld Barrens. Not moss, not lichen, not even the stubborn wiregrass that colonized every other barren patch of ground in the Northern Territories. Nothing lived here. Or so everyone believed. Sera walked because walking was better than stopping, and stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and she was not ready to feel the full weight of the evening yet. She would feel it later. Right now she had 3 small heartbeats to think about, and thinking about them required the particular cold clarity that came only when grief was held at a distance by necessity. 1 foot, then the other. The ash-pale ground crunched softly underfoot. The mist thickened as she moved deeper, the pine trees thinning and then stopping entirely, giving way to open gray landscape. The sky above was dark and starless, sealed with cloud. She was very alone. Sera had been alone before. She had been alone in crowds, alone in a shared bed, alone at the head of a table full of people who called her their Luna. She was familiar with the particular flavor of that loneliness, the specific chill of being surrounded and unseen. This was different. This was the clean, honest loneliness of open ground and no walls. She found she almost preferred it. The dizziness came without warning. One moment she was walking. The next the ground tilted sideways with the casual indifference of the world reminding her that she was, despite everything, a body. Hungry, cold, running on adrenaline that had now fully spent itself. She went down hard on one knee. Her hands hit the ash-pale earth, and she stayed there, head hanging, breathing in shallow increments while the world decided whether it was going to stop spinning. Get up, she told herself. Get up. You don't get to stop here. Her arms trembled. She couldn't. Then just breathe. Just breathe for a moment. She closed her eyes. And then the warmth came. It started in her core. The same golden spreading heat she'd felt in the guest chamber, but stronger now. Urgent. As though whatever lived inside her had sensed the collapse and decided it was not acceptable. It moved through her like slow fire, down into her legs, into her hands where they pressed against the cold ground. The trembling stopped. The dizziness receded. Sera opened her eyes. Her palms were glowing. Faintly, barely visible in the dark and mist, but undeniably real. A soft amber light pulsed from her skin in time with those 3 small rhythms. "You're keeping me alive," she whispered. The pulse strengthened once, like an answer. Something shifted in her chest. Not grief, not relief, not quite either. Something older than both. Something that felt less like an emotion and more like a law. "We go forward," it said. "We do not stop here." Sera stood up. She looked ahead into the gray dark of the barrens. Through the mist, at a distance she couldn't accurately measure, something rose against the sky. She had been looking at it for several minutes without registering it, the way the mind sometimes refuses unfamiliar shapes. It was a structure. Tall. Ancient. Built of the same pale gray stone as the ground itself, so that it seemed less constructed than grown, as though the earth had simply pushed it up 1 slow century at a time. A tower, or what remained of one, and from somewhere within it the faint, impossible smell of something warm. Food, her body said, before her mind had fully caught up. Sera pulled her traveling cloak tighter. She walked toward it. Chapter 5. The structure was not a tower. It was a temple. Sera understood this the moment she passed through the outer arch. A massive doorway carved from a single piece of pale stone, its lintel etched with figures she didn't immediately recognize. Animals, but wrong somehow. Too large, too angular, the proportions belonging to something that had never been catalogued in any bestiary she'd studied. She stepped into the courtyard and stopped. It was enormous. The kind of space that made you feel the specific smallness of being a single warm creature in a very old world. The walls rose on three sides, pale and smooth, and between the paving stones, gray stone fitted together with such precision there was barely a seam. Dark moss grew in thin lines like the world's most patient calligraphy. In the center of the courtyard was a well. Not a ruin of a well. A functioning one, with a stone lip worn smooth by what must have been centuries of hands, and a rope that looked impossibly recent. From the darkness below came the smell of cold, clean water and something else beneath it. Something that made the back of her throat feel alive in a way she didn't have language for. Sera was at the well's edge before she'd consciously decided to move. She pulled the rope. A bucket came up, dripping. She cupped her hands and drank. The water tasted of minerals and deep earth, and something that buzzed very faintly at the back of her teeth, like the first moment of a storm. She drank until she couldn't drink any more. "That water," said a voice, "is not for wolves." Sera spun. She had excellent reflexes. For years of Luna duties hadn't dulled them. If anything, the constant low-grade vigilance of managing a powerful pack had sharpened them past what formal training had achieved. She had her knife out and her feet planted before the voice had fully finished its sentence. There was no one in the courtyard. "Up," the voice said. She looked up, perched on the highest point of the temple wall. On a narrow ledge that should not have been able to support anything heavier than a bird, was a figure. Pale, utterly still, watching her with the patience of something that measured time in units she didn't have a name for. It leaped. Not climbed down. Not descended. Leaped, from a height of 40 feet, dropping through the misty air with a looseness that suggested an entirely different relationship with gravity than the one Sera had been operating under her whole life. It landed 10 feet from her without a sound. He landed. He straightened slowly. He was tall, genuinely tall, the kind of tall that registered as wrong before it registered as impressive. White hair, not the white of age, but the white of something that had never been any other color, worn loose to his shoulders. His eyes, when they found hers, were the pale silver gray of a winter sky right before it committed to snow. His skin had the faint luminescence of something that spent a great deal of time in darkness, and had adapted to generate its own light. He was wearing, she noticed distantly, clothes that looked both ancient and entirely functional. Dark leather. No insignia. No pack markings. He looked at her knife without concern. Then he looked, very deliberately, at her midsection. "You drank from the well of the first ones," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with an accent she couldn't place. "In ordinary circumstances, I would ask you to leave. But your circumstances," a pause. His silver eyes moved back to her face, "are not ordinary." "Who are you?" Sera asked. Her knife hand was steady. She was proud of that. "Selim," he said. "I am the last warden of the Ashfeld. I have kept this temple for," he considered, "longer than your pack has existed." "Warden of what, exactly?" He tilted his head. The movement was precise, economical, like someone who had long ago learned that unnecessary motion was a form of waste. "Of the old knowledge," he said. "Of the things your people forgot when they decided that power was simpler than wisdom." He studied her face. "You ran from somewhere tonight." "I walked." "You ran," he said, with the mild certainty of someone who could smell the adrenaline still working its way out of her system. "And whatever you ran from, you have not yet decided where you are running to." He paused again. "That is the most dangerous moment. The space between the leaving and the arriving. Wolves do not survive well in that space." Sera lowered the knife. Not because she trusted him. Because her arm was tired, and she was conserving everything she had left. "The water," she said. "You said it wasn't for wolves. What did it do?" Selim looked at her for a long moment. "For a wolf," he said carefully, "it would do nothing. Or nearly nothing. Perhaps a night's warmth. Perhaps a mild dream." He paused. "For what you are carrying, what they are carrying, inside you, the water is something closer to a first breath." Sera's hand moved to her stomach. It was involuntary. "You can sense them," she said. "This entire temple can sense them," Selim said quietly. He looked up at the pale stone walls surrounding them, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. Something that in a less ancient face she might have called awe. "I have been waiting in this place for a very long time, Ashvane Luna." His silver eyes returned to hers. "Not for you specifically. I did not know it would be you. But for them." He nodded at her stomach. "For what they carry. For what they will become." "You don't know what they'll become." "No," he agreed. "But I know what they already are." He turned toward the temple's inner doorway. a dark arch that exhaled warmth and the smell of something cooking. Come inside. You need heat and food and somewhere to sleep that isn't an ash field. He moved toward the door. I have been alone here for a very long time. I find, somewhat to my surprise, that I am glad for company. He didn't look back to see if she followed. She followed. Chapter 6. Time moved differently in the Ashfeld. There were no seasons inside the temple walls. Or rather, there was only one season, a kind of permanent deep autumn stillness, cool and amber-lit, that never quite tipped into winter and never warmed past the temperature of a room with a good fire and high ceilings. Outside, Sera knew, the northern territories were grinding through the worst cold months. Inside, the temple breathed steadily, like something alive and patient. She healed. The first 2 weeks she slept more than she'd slept in years. Deep, dreamless sleeping that felt less like rest and more like repair, as though her body had been waiting for permission to fix everything she'd been ignoring. Selim fed her without ceremony. Roasted root vegetables from the temple garden. Dense dark bread baked on the hearthstone. Broth made from something she didn't ask about because it was hot and it was good, and she had learned quickly that Selim answered questions in his own time regardless of when you asked them. He was not warm, exactly, but he was present. Consistently, reliably present, in the way that mattered more than warmth when you were a woman who had recently discovered that the warmth she'd been living inside had been a performance. By the 3rd week, she was restless enough to explore. The temple was larger than it appeared from the outside. Much larger. The outer courtyard was only the first layer. Beyond it, through a series of connected chambers, lay a library that made Ironmark's entire archive look like a pamphlet. Thousands of texts, rolled and stacked and shelved in alcoves carved directly into the stone walls. Many in languages Sera didn't recognize, and some in languages she was fairly certain no living person read anymore. She found Selim there most evenings, cross-legged on the floor with a text open across his knees, reading by the light of the pale globes that floated near the ceiling. Another thing she'd decided not to ask about yet. The language on the temple arch, she said one evening, lowering herself carefully onto the bench across from him. Her center of gravity was beginning to shift. The animal carvings. What are they? Selim looked up from his text. Wardens, he said. Like you. Not exactly like me. He set the scroll aside with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable, which it probably was. There were 12 of us originally, each bound to a different territory, each carrying a different aspect of the old knowledge. He paused. The others are gone. Some died. Some chose to sleep. Some walked away into the world and were absorbed by it. He said this without apparent grief, which somehow made it sadder. And you stayed. I had something to wait for. Sera placed both hands on her stomach. The gesture had become habit now. She did it constantly, unconsciously, the way you kept touching a new ring to make sure it was still there. Tell me about them, she said. What you sense. What you know. Selim was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pale globes floating near the ceiling, considering. The old bloodlines, he said finally, did not disappear when your people forgot them. They went underground. They passed through generations as recessive threads, diluting and concentrating and diluting again across centuries, waiting for the right combination. He looked at her. You are not simply a wolf, Sera Ashvane. Your maternal line carries something that has not expressed itself in 6 generations. A convergence. He paused. And whoever their father is. Ryker. The name tasted like a word in a language she was actively trying to forget. His line carries the other half of the convergence. The warrior thread. The dominance architecture. Selim's silver eyes were very direct. Apart, neither line produces anything unusual. Together. 3, Sera said. He nodded slowly. 3 aspects. 1 for each thread, and the 3rd for the place where the threads cross. He hesitated, which was unusual for him. I have read about this. I have never seen it. I did not fully believe it was possible until you walked into my courtyard and the well water lit up like a signal fire. Sera absorbed this. They kick, she said. Constantly. The one on the right especially. Something shifted in Selim's expression. The same thing she'd noticed the first night. The thing that looked like awe in a face that had forgotten how to show it easily. He looked at her stomach with an expression she was only now learning to read. It was reverence. The right one, he said quietly, is the one who feels everything first. 7 months after she'd dropped from the east wing window into the kitchen garden, the time came. She had known it was coming for 3 days. A specific quality of waiting had settled over the temple. The same waiting she recognized from childhood when a storm was building over the mountains, and the air went very still and very charged in the hours before it broke. Selim had prepared the inner chamber, the warmest room in the temple, deep in the structure where the stone held the heat of whatever burned beneath the barrens. Furs, lamplit, water heated in the great iron pot over the hearth. He had been, Sera reflected distantly, through the first wave of pain, preparing for this longer than she had. "I can't," she started. "You can," Selim said. He was beside her, and his hand was in hers, and his voice was the voice of someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall, and had not flinched once. "You have been doing this since the night you left. This is simply the last part of it. It's too much." "It is exactly enough," he said. "Open the door, Sera." The first child arrived with a sound like wind through stone corridors. A boy who didn't cry but instead drew one long breath and released it as something between a howl and a note of music, clear and carrying. Selim caught him with hands that trembled, just slightly, for the first time since she'd known him. "A name," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Evander," Sera said, and knew it immediately, the way you knew a word you'd always known but never needed to say aloud. 14 minutes later the second came in a rush of heat, so intense the candles guttered sideways. The boy's first breath fogged the air despite the warmth of the room. He opened his eyes before Selim had finished wrapping him, dark eyes alert, already scanning. "Brennan," Sera said. She pulled him against her chest, and he immediately stilled, as though he'd been waiting for exactly this specific warmth. Then the third. The room went very quiet. The quality of the quiet was different from ordinary silence. It had a texture to it, a weight, like the moment after a bell has finished ringing when the sound is gone, but the air still remembers it. The girl arrived without drama, without noise, without the particular violence that had accompanied her brothers. She simply appeared in the way that truly inevitable things appear, as though she had always been here and had simply been waiting for the world to be ready. She had silver eyes. Not gray, not pale. Silver. The same silver as Selim's, but lit from within with something warmer. "Isadora," Sera whispered. The baby looked at her with the focused attention of someone taking very careful notes. Selim stood back from the three of them. He stood in the doorway of the chamber, and Sera had known him long enough now to read the landscape of his face, the precise geography of an expression he had been holding at distance for a very long time, and was no longer holding at distance. He knelt, one knee on the stone floor of the ancient temple, his silver head bowed, his hands loose at his sides. "The Triad of Ashfeld," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The old texts did not do them justice. Sera looked down at her 3 children. Evander already straining against the wrapping to look at his brother. Brennan watching the ceiling with dark, calculating eyes. Isadora watching her mother with silver patience. Ryker wanted an heir, she thought, pressing her lips to Evander's forehead. "I built a legacy." Chapter 7. 5 years later, the courtyard of the Ashfeld temple rang with the sound of controlled chaos. "Again," Sera said. She stood at the center of the training ground she and Selim had cleared in the eastern courtyard. Flagstones swept clean of ash, a weapons rack built from pale timber along the far wall. She was wearing fitted leather sparring gear, her dark hair braided back, a short staff held loosely in both hands. Facing her was Evander. He was 5 years old and built like a small siege engine. Dense through the shoulders, low center of gravity, with the particular focused expression of a child who had decided very early that the gap between what he could do and what the adults could do was a personal insult requiring immediate correction. He held his practice staff in a 2-handed grip and watched his mother with gray eyes that missed nothing. He lunged. Sera blocked, redirected, swept his lead foot. He stumbled, caught himself, and before she could reset her stance, he dropped the staff entirely and shifted. The shift took less than 2 seconds. A shimmer of silver light, and a wolf pup stood where the boy had been. Large for his age, slate gray, already showing the bone structure of what he would eventually become. He hit her at knee height like a very determined boulder. Sera went down laughing. "That," called Brennan from the stone steps where he was eating a late apple and watching with the detached interest of someone who'd seen this exact sequence play out before, "is still cheating." "It's adaptive strategy," Evander said, shifting back and sitting on his mother's stomach with the authority of a victor claiming a hill. It's cheating and adaptive strategy, Isadora said without looking up. She was sitting beside Selim on the far bench, both of them bent over a large open text, her silver eyes tracking the page with a concentration that made her look, at 5, disturbingly like a very small scholar. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. Selim, to his credit, did not smile. But the line of his mouth did something subtle. Sera extracted herself from under Evander and stood, brushing ash dust from her leathers. She looked at her 3 children, Evander already resetting into his fighting stance, wanting to go again. Brennan finishing his apple and watching everything with those dark analytical eyes. Isadora running a small finger along a line of text, while Selim murmured something in the old language, and she nodded as though confirming something she'd suspected. 5 years. She had arrived in this place bleeding and hollow, dressed in traveling leathers with a knife in her hand and 3 secret heartbeats, and no plan beyond the next 10 minutes. She had been so gutted by the evening's events that she hadn't been able to feel the full weight of it. She'd carried it in installments, grief and rage in small manageable doses, because the full sum of it would have been unsurvivable all at once. But grief was strange that way. It didn't diminish. It composted. It became something else. She was stronger than she had been at Ironmark. Genuinely, physically stronger. Selim had trained her in the old forms, the pre-pack combat disciplines that had existed before wolves organized themselves into hierarchies and started mistaking rank for ability. She could track across the ash-pale ground in the dark. She could read 3 of the old languages now, enough to study the texts herself. She could hold the deep meditative stillness that allowed her to feel the barren's particular energy like a second skin. And she had Selim, not a mate bond. Not yet. Something was building between them that she had no clean name for. A thing constructed from 5 years of proximity and shared purpose, and the specific intimacy of being known by someone who had no reason to perform for you. He had seen her at the absolute bottom of herself, and he had not looked away, and he had not tried to fix it, and he had not made it about him. She admitted to herself on quiet evenings, rather profoundly in love with him. She hadn't said it. He hadn't said it. But it lived in the spaces between them like the temple's own warmth. Present, sustaining, requiring no announcement. She was thinking about this, watching Isadora trace a symbol in the old text with focused silver eyes, when Selim stood up. He didn't move suddenly. He never moved suddenly. But there was something in the quality of his stillness that had changed, a new attention, like a compass needle swinging. Selim, Sera said. He held up one hand. Listening. From somewhere above the temple walls, a bird descended. Large, black, with the intelligent eyes of something that was being used as a deliberate vehicle rather than acting on instinct. It landed on the stone wall beside the weapons rack, ruffled its feathers once, and extended one leg. A message capsule, bound with a cord the color of old blood. Evander was already across the courtyard, fast and curious. "Can I?" "No," Sera said, and crossed to the wall herself. She unbound the cord, unrolled the message inside. The seal at the top was one she recognized from a lifetime ago. A wolf's head inside a circle of iron links. The Ironmark crest. But it had been modified. Below the wolf, someone had stamped a crown. "He's making a move," she said. Selim was at her shoulder. He read without touching the paper. "The Grand Conclave of Northern Pax," he said quietly. "A summit. All free alphas required to attend and render formal acknowledgement of." He paused. "He is calling himself High Warden. He always wanted a title that sounded like inevitability," Sera said. "His heir is named," Selim continued. "A boy. Davin. Claims the child manifested his wolf at age 3. He looked at her sidelong. 3 years old." Sera made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "He used the root accelerants. I'd wager everything on it." She looked at her children. Evander, who had shifted and shifted back 100 times before his 2nd birthday because it was as natural to him as breathing. Brennan, whose hands sometimes ran hot enough to warm a room when he was thinking hard. Isadora, whose voice had twice now produced a sound that made every living thing within earshot simply stop. A forced early shift. That child will spend his whole life paying for it. She rolled the message back up. She looked north, past the temple walls, past the gray reach of the barrens, toward the distant suggestion of mountains that meant Ironmark. "Mama," said Isadora. She had closed the text. She was watching Sera with silver eyes that were far too old for a 5-year-old face, and had been since the day she was born. "Are we going?" The other two went still. Evander in his fighting stance, Brennan with the apple core forgotten in his hand. Sera looked at Selim. The connection between them, whatever it was called, whatever name it eventually earned, communicated something in the space of a shared look that would have taken a long conversation to say aloud. He gave the smallest nod. "Go and clean up," Sera said to her children. "Put on your good leathers." She turned back toward the temple's inner door. "All of you, where are we going?" Brennan asked. His voice was very careful and very controlled, like someone who already knew the answer and wanted to hear it said. Sera paused in the doorway. "We are going," she said, "to meet your father, and to collect something that belongs to us." Behind her, she heard Evander make a sound of pure, uncomplicated anticipation. Chapter 8. The Grand Conclave Hall of the Northern Territories had been built to impress. It sat at the center of Veldmore, the neutral city, the old city, the city that belonged to no single pack and therefore belonged to all of them. And it was everything Ironmark Keep was not. Where Ironmark was honest stone and function, Veldmore's Conclave Hall was ambition rendered in architecture. White limestone columns, vaulted ceilings painted with scenes from the founding wars, floors of polished black granite that reflected the torchlight in long orange ribbons. Tonight, every torch was lit. The hall was packed with the weight of gathered power. Alphas and their seconds and their ceremonial guards, representatives from 14 packs spread across the northern and western territories. The air was thick with competing scents, expensive furs, the particular musk of dominance displays being carefully managed by men and women who understood that the conclave floor was a different kind of battlefield. At the far end, on a raised dais of white stone, sat Ryker Ashvane. 5 years had done what stress and sustained dishonesty usually did to a face. He was still imposing. The bone structure didn't change, and the shoulders didn't narrow. But there was something carved away around his eyes, a tightness at the corners of his mouth that spoke of a man who had been maintaining a particular version of himself for long enough that it was beginning to cost him. He wore a new chain of office, heavy iron links with a stylized crown pendant, and on his head, because apparently the chain wasn't sufficient, an actual circlet of twisted iron. "High Warden," the message had said. Looking at him now, Sera thought, a man who needs to announce his own power is a man who has started to doubt it. Beside him sat Nadia. Nadia had changed more than Ryker. She had the look of a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted and discovered, upon receiving it, that wanting had been the better part. She was dressed beautifully. She had always known how to dress, but her eyes moved constantly, checking exits, checking faces, with the vigilance of someone who understood that a position built on someone else's removal was a position with a particular kind of vulnerability. At her feet, on a small ceremonial cushion, sat a boy. Davin, 5 years old. Small for his age, with Ryker's auburn hair and Nadia's nervous eyes. He was holding a carved wooden wolf and staring at the floor with the focused determination of a child trying very hard to be invisible in a situation that kept requiring him to be visible. Sera recognized that expression. She had worn it herself at various points in various rooms. The expression of someone who understood instinctively that the performance being staged around them was not quite honest, and had not yet learned how to name that understanding. She felt, looking at the boy, a complicated thing. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something that was the seed of it. Ryker stood. The hall quieted with the well-trained efficiency of people who had learned that the High Warden's silences were tests. "Brothers and sisters of the northern blood," Ryker began. His voice was practiced, resonant, filling the vaulted space with the ease of long habit. "For 5 years we have been building. 5 years of secured borders, of broken rogue factions, of treaties that have held because they were built on strength rather than sentiment." Appreciative murmuring from the front rows. The packs closest to Ironmark, the ones with the most to gain from his continued goodwill. "Tonight we formalize what has already become true in practice." He gestured to Davin. Nadia nudged the boy's shoulder. Davin stood, small and careful, and raised one hand in the wave he had clearly been practicing. "My heir," Ryker said. "Davin, who carries the Ashvane bloodline forward, who will hold what I have built." The applause was polite. Sera, from her position outside the hall's main doors, she had arrived early enough to map the space, to identify the columns and galleries and the exact geometry of the room, could smell the doubt in it. It smelled like overripe fruit. Sweet on the surface, wrong underneath. And tonight, Ryker continued, his voice dropping into the register he used for finality, I ask each alpha present to render the oath of recognition, to place this coalition under a single authority, to end the era of fractured packs and begin. The doors opened. Not violently. Not with drama. They simply opened, both of them, at the same moment, pushed by two small pairs of hands from the outside. Evander walked in first, because Evander always walked in first. He had Sera's dark coloring and Ryker's bone structure, which was unfortunately arresting, and he moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had been told exactly where he was going and saw no reason to rush or hesitate. He was wearing fitted dark leather, his slate-gray eyes scanning the room with the systematic attention of someone assessing terrain. Brennan followed a half-step behind and to the right, the instinctive positioning of a second, supporting and watching. His hands were loose at his sides. The air around him was a degree or two warmer than the air around everyone else. Isadora came last. She walked with the particular quality of stillness and motion that Selim had, and that Sera had spent 5 years trying to understand. Her silver eyes moved across the room without urgency, cataloging. She looked, at 5 years old, like someone who had walked into many rooms and found them all more or less predictable. Behind the children, filling the doorway with the kind of presence that caused the human nervous system to file an urgent report before the conscious mind had finished processing the visual. Selim. He was wearing the warden's formal attire, deep gray, almost silver, with the temple's sigil worked into the collar in pale thread. He was unarmed in the visible sense, which everyone in the room who understood anything immediately recognized as the specific confidence of someone who did not need visible weapons. He stood behind the children and looked at Sera Ashvane across the length of the hall with the expression of a man who had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. And then Sera stepped through the doors. She had not worn the bonding white. She had not worn ceremonial gray or formal pack colors. She was wearing armor, dark leather reinforced with panels of the pale Ashfeld stone, fitted to her precisely over 5 years of training, light enough to move in freely, strong enough to matter. Over it a long charcoal cloak, clasped with the temple's sigil, the 12 wardens carved in miniature, surrounding a central open eye. Her hair was braided back from a face that was, by any measure, harder and more present than the face that had dropped from a third-floor window 5 years ago. She walked through the parted crowd without hurrying. She stopped 15 feet from the dais. "Hello, Ryker," she said. The hall's silence was the silence of a room full of people simultaneously deciding not to be the first to speak. Ryker stared. The color had drained from his face with the completeness of a tide going out. Beside him, Nadia had gone perfectly, absolutely still. The stillness of a woman running rapid internal calculations. "Sera." Ryker's voice was barely functional. "You, the Barrens. You were. Not dead," Sera said. "I know. I imagine that's been inconvenient." Behind her, she heard Evander make a sound that was almost, not quite, but almost, a laugh. Chapter 9. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Ryker's face moved through a sequence of expressions that would have been almost interesting to map. Disbelief collapsing into recognition, recognition sharpening into something that was trying to be authority and not quite making it. "Guards," he said. 6 of Ironmark's elite moved from their positions along the walls. They were good. Sera had trained 2 of them herself, which meant she knew their habits. They formed a loose arc between Ryker's dais and the intruders, hands on weapons, eyes on Selim because Selim was the most visibly threatening thing in the room and threat assessment was the first thing you learned. Selim looked at them with the patient expression of a man watching rain fall. "Stand down," Sera said. "Not to the guards. To the room. I have not come to fight. I have come to speak. If Alpha Ashvane would prefer to resolve this privately, he has approximately 30 seconds to make that decision before I make it publicly instead." Ryker's jaw worked. He looked at the assembled alphas, 14 packs, all watching, all filing every detail away for future use. He understood, she could see him understanding, that whatever happened in the next few minutes would be the story told at every pack gathering for the next generation. He did not take the 30 seconds. "Whatever performance this is," Ryker said, and his voice had recovered enough of its command register to almost sound like himself. "It ends now. You were declared." He stopped. "Declared what?" Sera asked. "Say it clearly." "For the room." A muscle moved in his jaw. Declared unable to fulfill the Luna's duties, he said. On what grounds? Medical grounds. Healer Voss confirmed. Where is Healer Voss? Sera asked. She looked around the room with the air of someone genuinely curious. Is he here tonight? I would very much like to speak with him. A rustling near the left colonnade. A small, gray-haired man who had been attempting, with increasing desperation, to achieve invisibility behind a much larger alpha from the western reaches. He was not succeeding. 2 alphas from the outer packs, people who owed Ironmark nothing and Veldmore neutrality everything, stepped aside, and suddenly Voss was visible, alone, in a small open space that felt very exposed. Healer Voss, Sera said. Come forward, please. Voss came forward the way a man walks to something he has been dreading for 5 years. One reluctant step at a time, as though each footfall required a separate act of will. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at her face. He looked at the children. He looked at Selim. He appeared to briefly consider fainting. The examination you performed 5 years ago, Sera said. Her voice was conversational, unhurried. The blood tests, the moon charts, the second consultation you claimed to have requested. She paused. Walk us through your findings. My Luna, the results were. Voss was sweating visibly despite the chill of the hall. His eyes kept sliding to the children, to Evander specifically, whose resemblance to Ryker was the kind of evidence that required no argument. The results were as reported. At the time, the readings suggested. The readings, Sera said, or the readings you were paid to report? The hall exhaled. It was a collective sound. Not a gasp exactly, more the sound of a room full of people releasing breath they'd been holding without realizing it. Voss's mouth opened, closed. His hands found each other in front of him and locked tight. She is lying, Nadia said. Her voice was sharp and immediate. Too immediate. The sharpness of someone who had rehearsed a response to this exact accusation and deployed it a half-second too fast. Every head in the room turned to her. Nadia stood. She was composed. She had always been composed. It was the quality Sera had most admired in her. Once, before she understood that composure could be armor or it could be performance, and that from the outside they looked identical. This woman abandoned her pack, Nadia said, projecting to the room with the fluency of someone who had been practicing for exactly this audience. She fled rather than accept a medical reality. Whatever story she has constructed in 5 years of exile. I didn't flee, Sera said calmly. I was escorted to the eastern border by Ironmark guards and told that the barrens were my destination. I have the names of the 2 guards if anyone would like to verify. She looked at the room. I also have 3 children who were present at my examination in the healing chamber. Alive, healthy, standing in this hall. She looked at Voss. You have a choice, she said, and her voice dropped, losing the projection, becoming something quieter and more direct. You made a decision 5 years ago under pressure. That decision had consequences you perhaps didn't fully anticipate when you made it. She paused. You can continue to carry it, or you can set it down tonight, in this room, in front of witnesses, and let the truth do what truths do when they're finally allowed to move. Voss looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked at Ryker. Ryker's expression was the expression of a man transmitting a very clear warning across a crowded room. Do not. Voss looked away from Ryker. He looked at Sera. I was approached, he said. His voice was barely audible. The hall leaned in. 3 days before the examination. He stopped. Started again. By the woman who is now seated on the Luna dais. She came to me with gold and with information about my son who had been caught with the Eastern Rogue faction. His hands were shaking. She said the charges would disappear. She said the gold would clear his debts. All I had to do was alter the readings. Report a barren womb. He lifted his eyes. The womb was not barren. The readings were altered. I have lived with that every day for 5 years. The silence that followed had a different texture from the silences before it. Heavier, more settled. The silence of something that had been wrong for a long time and had finally, audibly, been set right. Nadia moved. Not toward Sera. Toward the side door. The servants' exit, half hidden behind the nearest column. The exit that someone would only know about if they'd studied the hall's architecture in advance. She has been taking notes on this room for months, Isadora said. She said it conversationally, from her position slightly behind Sera, her silver eyes on Nadia with the dispassionate attention of someone reading a document. Her voice was small and clear, and carried in the particular way that voices carry in stone halls built for ceremony. Nadia stopped. Everyone looked at the 5-year-old. Isadora looked back at them all with the calm of someone who saw no reason to be self-conscious about being correct. "The third column from the left," Isadora said. "The mark at knee height." She scored it herself. "It is not decorative. It shows where the hall's load-bearing support is thinnest." She intended to use it. She tilted her head. She has been planning an exit from this arrangement for approximately 8 months. She did not expect my mother to arrive first. The silence was absolute. Nadia looked at the girl, at the silver eyes, at the 5-year-old face wearing the expression of someone reading the room like a text, and something moved across her face that was beyond calculation. Something that was simply rawly afraid. "How?" Ryker said. His voice had lost its architecture entirely. It was just a sound a man made when the story he'd been living inside had come apart at every seam simultaneously. "How does she?" "She is Isadora," Sera said simply. "She is the third of the Ashfeld triad, and she is telling you the truth." Sera looked at her daughter with an expression she didn't bother to conceal. She always does. Chapter 10. The hall reorganized itself around the new reality the way water reorganized itself around a stone dropped into it. Concentric rings of reaction moving outward from the center. In the center, Ryker, standing on his dais, looking at his 3 children for the first time. He came down the steps the way a man moved when his body was operating ahead of his conscious decision, pulled by something older than choice. He stopped at the base of the dais and stood there, 10 feet from Sera and the children, and looked. He looked at Evander first. Evander looked back with the direct, evaluating gaze of someone running an assessment and not troubling to conceal it. The resemblance between them was immediate and structural. The jaw, the brow, the particular set of the shoulders. Ryker's own face, younger, stripped of the stress lines, wearing an expression of frank appraisal rather than managed authority. He looked at Brennan. Brennan had gone very still in the way he went still when he was paying close attention to something. Hands loose, dark eyes moving between Ryker's face and the space around him with the systematic attention of someone mapping both the terrain and the weather simultaneously. He looked at Isadora. Isadora looked back at him with silver eyes that saw. Sera had long since accepted. Considerably more than most people wanted seen. 3, Ryker said. His voice was barely functional. It had the quality of a man speaking to himself, processing aloud. 3, Sera confirmed. You were pregnant. He looked at her. That night, in the healing chamber. You were already. Yes. Something moved across his face. It was not guilt exactly. Guilt required a sustained honesty about cause and effect that she wasn't sure Ryker had ever been capable of. It was closer to the specific horror of a man seeing the full dimension of a mistake he had made while telling himself it was a decision. They are magnificent, he said. And there it was. The thing she had been braced for. The thing that had been inevitable from the moment she walked into this room. The greed arriving ahead of the reckoning. The way it always did with men who had confused desire with entitlement. His eyes moved across the 3 of them with a hunger that had nothing to do with fatherhood and everything to do with acquisition. They are Ashvane blood. They are mine, Sera said. Blood does not lie, Sera. His voice was recovering its register. She could watch it happening. The reassembly of the authority persona, piece by careful piece, the way a man put on armor. The ancient rights of lineage are clear. I am the Alpha. They carry my line. By the laws of the conclave. By the laws of the conclave, said a voice behind Sera. A man who severs his mate bond relinquishes all claims that derive from that bond, including claims of lineage. Selim stepped forward. He moved through the space between Sera and Ryker with the unhurried certainty of someone who understood geometry and knew exactly where he needed to be. He stood at Sera's left shoulder. Not in front of her, deliberately not in front of her, and looked at Ryker with silver eyes that contained an expression Ryker clearly found more unsettling than open hostility. Patience. Pure, bottomless patience. The patience of something that had watched men like Ryker rise and fall so many times that the individual instances had become essentially indistinguishable. And who, Ryker said, looking Selim up and down with the practiced contempt of a dominant male assessing a rival. Are you? I am the last warden of Ashfeld, Selim said. I am the keeper of the old laws you just cited and would prefer applied selectively. A pause. And I am the man who was present when your children drew their first breath, who fed them and taught them and was there for every moment you were not. His voice was entirely level. You may make of that what you wish. Ryker's jaw tightened. He looked at Sera, the particular look of a man recalibrating a situation he thought he had mapped. The Warden of Ashfeld, he said. A legend. A ghost story. Legends have a tendency to become inconvenient when they walk into your hall, Selim said. Father. The word came from the dais. Not from Sera's children. From Davin, small, pale-haired Davin, who had descended from his cushion at some point during the preceding minutes, and was now standing at the edge of the dais steps, wooden wolf clutched to his chest, looking at Ryker with watery eyes. The room felt it. Every person in the hall felt the particular weight of that single word from that particular direction in that particular moment. Ryker's head turned. Davin looked at the three children, at Evander's easy confidence, at Brennan's contained intensity, at Isadora's silver assessment, and then back at his father with an expression that was too old for his face. The expression of a child who had understood the dynamics of the room he lived in for longer than anyone had given him credit for. Are they staying? Davin asked. Ryker stared at his son. Davin. Because if they're staying, Davin said carefully, with the precision of a small person who had learned to choose words as a survival strategy, I would like to not be on the cushion anymore. The silence that followed had an entirely different quality from any of the silences before it. Sera looked at the boy, at the wooden wolf, at the careful, watchful face of a child who had been used as a prop in a performance he hadn't auditioned for and was very, very tired. She looked at Nadia. Nadia had not moved toward the exit again. She was standing very still, and the composure had finally broken. Not dramatically, not with weeping, but in the specific way that composure broke when the weight of it became simply too much to maintain. Her face was bare in a way Sera had never seen it. Without the calculation, without the management. Just a woman standing in the consequence of her own choices, looking at her son asking to step down from his cushion. Tell me, Sera said to her. Quietly. Not for the room, for Nadia. Was any of it real? Was there a single moment that wasn't a strategy? Nadia's eyes moved to hers. The answer took a long time to arrive. The first month, Nadia said. Her voice was very small. Before I understood how far it had gone. Before I knew what I'd agreed to. She stopped. I was afraid of you. You were always so certain. You always knew what the right thing was, and you did it, and I couldn't. She stopped again. I told myself you wouldn't miss what I was taking, because you had everything already. I had nothing, Sera said. I was performing certainty every single day, because I was the Luna, and the Luna was not allowed to be uncertain. And you knew that. You lived beside me for years, and you knew that. Nadia looked at the floor. Yes, she said. I knew that. Ryker was still looking at Davin. Davin was still looking at him. The wooden wolf turned slowly in the boy's hands. She gave him accelerant potions, Sera said, her voice lifting back to the room. To force an early shift. To produce the prodigy your announcement required. She looked at the assembled alphas. Ask your healers what forced early shifting does to a pups-wolf connection. Ask them what it costs. Alpha Gregor of the Stonewater Pack, a large, blunt-faced man who had been watching the entire proceeding with the focused expression of someone taking extremely careful mental notes, cleared his throat. I have a healer, he said. She's standing 3 feet from me. Marta. He looked at the woman beside him. Is that true? The force shift, what does it do? Marta, a compact woman with the direct eyes of someone who had no patience for politics, looked at Davin. It severs the natural bond between the wolf and the human half, she said flatly. The wolf becomes harder to access. The child becomes, she paused, choosing the clinical word carefully, diminished. Over time. It cannot be reversed. The room absorbed this. Ryker looked at his son. Davin looked at his father. Something happened in Ryker's face that Sera had not expected, and that she found, despite everything, almost impossible to watch. Not because it was ugly, but because it was genuine. For the first time in the entire evening, perhaps for the first time in longer than that, the performance dropped entirely. And underneath it was a man who had just understood, fully and without cushioning, what had been done to his son in his name, and with his implicit permission. It was grief. Raw, unmanaged, honest grief. It didn't make him good. It didn't undo 5 years. It didn't change a single thing that had happened in the healing chamber, or the East Wing guest room, or the long cold walk to the eastern border. But it was real. And Sera, who had spent 5 years learning in the Ashfeld temple that the most dangerous thing about hatred was how much energy it consumed, filed it away. Chapter 11. The hall had settled into a new configuration. The kind of configuration that emerged after a large and complicated truth had been spoken aloud in a room full of people who would now have to decide what to do with it. Ryker had not moved from the base of the dais steps. He was looking at his son, and Davin was looking back at him, and the wooden wolf was still turning in the boy's hands. Sera let it breathe for a moment. Then she turned to the room. "Healer Voss," she said. Voss, who had been standing in his small exposed clearing with the expression of a man who had confessed and was now waiting to learn the sentencing, looked up. "5 years ago you made a choice under duress," Sera said. "That choice had consequences you could not fully control once it was made. I understand the mechanism of that." She paused. "Your license to practice is suspended pending a full review by the Conclave Healers Council. You will submit a complete written account of the transaction, dates, amounts, instructions given, to the council within 7 days." She looked at him steadily. "If the account is complete and honest, the council will determine what comes next. If it is not complete, I will complete it for you, and the council will determine what comes next under considerably less favorable circumstances." Voss nodded. The nod of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been told he could set it down, at a cost, and found the cost acceptable. "The evidence of the transaction," said Isadora, from her position at Sera's side. Everyone looked at her. Isadora looked at Voss. "You kept the payment record," she said. "Not a question. It is in a locked box under the floorboard in your examination chamber. Second board from the left wall, 3 feet from the window." She blinked her silver eyes. "You kept it because you thought you might need it one day. You were correct." Voss stared at her. "How?" he said very quietly. "She reads residue," Selim said, equally quietly from behind Sera's shoulder. "Memory leaves traces on objects and spaces. She has been able to do it since she was approximately 18 months old." A pause. "We find it is most efficient to simply answer her questions directly rather than attempting to determine in advance what she already knows." Brennan made a small sound that was definitely a laugh, quickly converted into a cough. Sera did not smile, but it was a near thing. She turned to the assembled alphas. "I want to speak clearly," she said, "about what I am and am not here to do tonight." She moved to the center of the floor, away from Ryker's dais, away from Selim and the children, standing alone in the open space where the room's attention naturally gathered. "I am not here to claim the High Warden title that Ryker has constructed for himself. I have no interest in it. A title invented to consolidate power over packs who did not request consolidation is not a title I want." She looked at the 14 alphas in turn, meeting each gaze briefly, directly. "Your packs are your own. Your borders are your own. I am not here to replace one centralized authority with another." Alpha Gregor of Stonewater shifted his weight. "Then what are you here for, Ashvane?" "2 things, Sera said. First, the Ironmark pack. I was its Luna. I was removed from that position through fraud and coercion. I am reclaiming my standing." She looked at Ryker. "Not as your Luna. That bond was severed by your own hand, and I have no interest in restoring it. As the pack's independently recognized alpha female, with full standing under the old laws that Voss's payment records will confirm were the laws in effect at the time of my removal." The Conclave's senior elder, a white-haired woman named Aldra who had been sitting in the same carved chair for 30 years watching men make large claims and waiting to see which ones held, leaned forward slightly. "The old laws do support that standing," Aldra said. Her voice was dry and precise, the voice of someone who had the relevant texts memorized and found the current proceedings simultaneously tiresome and vindicating. "A Luna removed through documented fraud retains her rank. The pack affiliation defaults to dual authority pending resolution." She looked at Ryker over her spectacles. "You should have had better lawyers." Ryker's expression was the expression of a man discovering, at significant personal cost, that the details he had delegated were the ones that mattered. "And the second thing," Sera continued. She looked at the hall, at the white columns and the painted ceilings and the black granite floor reflecting all of them back at themselves in long orange light. "The second thing is this." She turned to Nadia. Nadia had not moved. She was still standing beside the dais, still wearing the expression of a woman who had run out of calculations and was simply present in the outcome of them. "Nadia," Sera said. Her voice was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was something more precise than either. The voice of a woman who had spent 5 years in a temple full of old knowledge learning to be accurate rather than emotional. "You conspired to have me declared medically unfit through a fraudulent examination. You used that fraud to facilitate the dissolution of my bond and my removal from the pack. You used forbidden alchemy in a pregnancy, and that alchemy caused lasting harm to a child who had no part in any of your decisions." Nadia's chin came up slightly, the last remnant of the composure armor. "I won't pretend I didn't do those things," Nadia said. "No," Sera said. "I don't think you will. You are many things, Nadia. A coward isn't one of them." She paused. "That makes this harder, actually." Nadia blinked. She had not expected that. "If you were simply malicious, it would be easier to sentence you cleanly," Sera said. "But you are not simply malicious. You are someone who wanted something badly enough to do monstrous things to get it, and who has now spent 5 years watching the monstrous things compound in ways you didn't anticipate." She looked at Davin, still on the dais steps, still watching. "Including that." Nadia's gaze moved to her son. The composure broke again. "Not all the way, but enough." "What are you going to do?" Nadia asked. "I am going to tell you what I am not going to do," Sera said. "I am not going to send you to the Barrens. You would not survive it, and I am not interested in your death. I am not going to imprison you, because imprisonment produces nothing useful for anyone, including you." She paused. "You are stripped of the Luna title, which was never legitimately yours. You are stripped of the Ashvane name. You will retain your own family standing, reduced, because your family will have something to say about this, and that is between you and them." Another pause. "And you will remain in proximity to your son, because whatever you did, he did not do it, and he deserves a mother who is present even if that mother is one he will spend years learning to see clearly." Nadia stared at her. "That's it," she said. And there was something in the question. Not relief exactly, but the confused disorientation of someone who had been braced for a blow and felt instead the specific discomfort of mercy they hadn't earned. "That's not nothing," Sera said. "Losing the name you spent 5 years building yourself into is not nothing. Being present in your son's life while he learns what you did and decides for himself what to do with that knowledge is not nothing." Her voice was very level. "I suspect it will be considerably harder than whatever punishment you were expecting." Nadia looked at the floor. After a moment, she nodded. Sera turned to Ryker. He was still at the base of the dais steps. He had not moved during the sentencing. He had watched it with the particular stillness of a man who understood that his moment was coming and was not running from it. To his credit, she walked toward him. She stopped 5 feet away. She looked at him, at the circlet, at the chain of office, at the man inside the architecture of power he'd spent 5 years constructing. And she looked for the things she'd told herself she would look for when she got here. The things she'd needed to know before she could make the decision she'd already made but hadn't yet announced. She found it, in the way he was looking at Davin, in the grief that had briefly broken through, in the exhaustion behind his eyes that was the exhaustion of a man who had been maintaining a lie so large for so long that it had become the primary occupation of his existence. He was not good. He had not become good. But he was tired of being this particular version of bad. That was something. Not enough. But something. "Sera Ashvane," Sera said, and her voice lifted again, carrying to the room. "You severed our bond of your own will. You had me removed from the pack through fraud. You were complicit in whether or not you commissioned it. You sent me to the eastern border knowing what lay beyond it." She paused. "And you have spent 5 years building a structure of authority on a foundation you knew was rotten." Ryker held her gaze. She gave him credit for that. "The High Warden title ends tonight," Sera said. "The coalition you've constructed through obligation and implicit threat dissolves. Each pack represented in this hall returns to its own sovereign standing." She heard, from the assembled alphas, a sound that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but somewhere in the register of both. "Ironmark remains Ironmark. You retain your alpha standing within it, because stripping an alpha of their rank absent a formal challenge creates a power vacuum that hurts the pack before it hurts the alpha, and I am not interested in hurting the pack." Ryker blinked. "You are," Sera continued, "stripped of the fabricated title, stripped of the coalition authority, stripped of the conclave representative seat, which will pass to Davin when he comes of age, and will be held in trust by Elder Aldra until that time. She paused. And you will answer to the conclave healer's review regarding the forced shifting. Whatever that review determines, you will comply with fully and without appeal. The silence had a different quality again. The quality of a judgment that was neither execution nor exoneration. Something more complicated than either. Something that required the room to actually think rather than simply react. Ryker looked at her for a long moment. Why? He said. It was a genuine question. She could tell because there was no strategy in it. Just a man trying to understand something that didn't fit the map he'd been using. Because I have 3 children, Sera said simply. And I refuse to teach them that power is proven by destruction. She looked at him steadily. You are going to live with what you did, Ryker. You are going to watch our children become who they are going to become. And every single day you are going to understand, with increasing clarity, what you threw away. She paused. That is not mercy. That is the most precise consequence I could construct. She turned away from him. She walked back to her children. Evander was watching her with gray eyes that were slightly too bright. Brennan had his arms crossed and was doing an admirable impression of someone unmoved. Isadora was watching Davin. Mama, Isadora said quietly, not looking away from the boy on the dais steps. He's very lonely. Sera looked at Davin, at the wooden wolf, at the careful, watchful, exhausted 5-year-old face. I know, she said. She walked to the dais steps. She crouched down so she was level with him. He looked at her with Nadia's eyes and Ryker's hair and his own expression, which belonged to no one but himself. That wolf, Sera said, nodding at the carved toy. Did you name him? Davin blinked. He looked down at the carving as though he'd forgotten he was holding it. Grim, he said, very quietly. Grim, Sera repeated. That's a good name for a wolf. She looked at him steadily. Davin, would you like to come down from the steps? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped down. Chapter 12. The conclave hall had been arranged for a coronation. It had become, instead, something more difficult to name and considerably more durable. The kind of proceeding that got written into the record books not as a triumph or a defeat, but as a reckoning. The kind of evening that people who were present would spend the rest of their lives describing to people who weren't, always beginning with the same phrase. I was there when. The assembled alphas were not leaving. This was notable. Conclaves typically emptied quickly after the formal business concluded. Powerful people had territories to return to and preferred to process significant political developments in private before committing to public positions. But no one was moving toward the doors. They were standing in small groups across the hall, talking in the low urgent registers of people recalibrating, and they were watching Sera, watching the children, watching Selim, who had positioned himself near the left colonnade with a cup of water he hadn't touched, and the expression of a man entirely content to be uninteresting to everyone in the room who wasn't Sera. Elder Aldra had descended from her carved chair and was making her deliberate way across the floor towards Sera with the momentum of a woman who moved slowly and arrived precisely on time. Ashvane Luna, Aldra said. Just Sera, Sera said. The Luna title is in review. Aldra looked at her over her spectacles with the expression of someone who had heard a great many things described as in review, and had her own views on how those reviews typically concluded. The dual authority mechanism I cited will require a formal conclave session to resolve. 7 days here in Veldmore. Both parties present. She glanced toward Ryker, who was still standing near the dais with Davin, engaged in what appeared to be a very quiet and very difficult conversation. Assuming both parties remain cooperative. They will, Sera said. Aldra looked at her sideways. You sound certain. He's exhausted, Sera said simply. Maintaining a large lie is the most tiring work there is. He's been doing it for 5 years. The relief of stopping is going to be stronger than the instinct to continue. In a week he'll barely remember why he was fighting so hard. Aldra considered this. You have a clear view of him. I was his mate for 4 years, Sera said. I knew him before the ambition got loud enough to drown everything else out. She paused. He was not always this. Aldra looked at her for a moment with the assessing attention of someone who had spent 30 years in the conclave seat learning to distinguish between the people who said things because they were true and the people who said things because they sounded well. No, Aldra said at last. I don't suppose he was. She turned to go, then paused. Your children, she said, without turning back. The girl especially. The silver eyes. Another pause. The warden's eyes. Yes, Sera said. Said Aldra, and continued on her way. Sera turned to find Selim at her shoulder. Not suddenly, he was never sudden, but with the quality of presence that she had stopped noticing as a rival because it had simply become the baseline of every room she was in. Aldra's suspects, she said quietly. Aldra has suspected since approximately 30 seconds after Isadora spoke, Selim said, equally quietly. She is deciding what to do with the suspicion. What do you think she'll do? A pause. Nothing public. She is a woman who understands that some knowledge is most useful when it is held privately. His silver gaze moved across the room. Checking, cataloging, the habitual vigilance of someone who had kept a temple alone for a very long time and had not survived that by being careless. The room is settling. The immediate danger has passed. It was never really a dangerous room, Sera said. No, Selim agreed. You had already done the dangerous work before you walked in. She looked at him. He was looking at the hall, at the columns and the painted ceiling and the people reorganizing themselves around a new arrangement of power. And his profile was the profile she had been looking at for 5 years across workbenches and training grounds and fireside evenings in the temple library. And she knew it as well as she knew her own. Selim, she said. He turned. Thank you, she said. For all of it. For opening the door. For the water from the well. For the texts and the training and the... She stopped. The list was too long. It compressed into something simpler. For staying. His expression shifted. Not dramatically. It never did. But in the small economy of his face, the movement was significant. The silver eyes went warmer. I told you, he said. I had been waiting for something interesting. And, she said. A pause that was exactly as long as it needed to be. It has been, he said, considerably more than interesting. She laughed. It came out small and real and slightly surprised. The laugh of someone who has been serious for a long time and rediscovers levity like an old coat found at the back of a wardrobe. Familiar, unexpected, still fitting perfectly. Evander materialized at her elbow with the timing of a child who had been listening for exactly the right moment to intervene. Are you two going to do the looking at each other thing for much longer? He said, with the frank aesthetic criticism of a 5-year-old. Or can we talk about the part where we go home? Home, Brennan said, appearing on her other side, is an interesting question actually. Because technically, Ironmark, Isadora said serenely, from 3 feet away where she was apparently in the middle of examining the carved detail on the nearest column with focused silver interest. We will stay at Ironmark while the conclave process resolves. Then we will return to Ashfeld for the cold months. She paused. And then we will decide. The 3 of them looked at their sister. She said we, Brennan observed. She does that now, Evander said. She's been doing it since breakfast. I have been doing it, Isadora said patiently, for considerably longer than breakfast. You only just noticed. Selim made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Brief, quiet, genuine. Sera looked at him. He looked back at her. She looked at her 4 children. 3 born in a temple during a lightning storm, and 1 holding a carved wooden wolf, and standing slightly apart in the careful way of someone who had not yet learned that belonging was something you could simply step into. And she felt the thing she had not let herself feel for 5 years, because feeling it required believing it was real, and she had not been ready to believe. Safety. Actual safety. Not performed certainty. Not managed appearances. The deep, cellular safety of a woman standing in the right place with the right people, knowing with the full weight of her body and her history that she had built this with her own hands. Right, she said. Evander, stop interrogating the room's architecture. Brennan, your hands are warming up. Cool it down before you scorch someone's cloak. Isadora, she looked at her daughter. What are you reading in that column? Structural memory, Isadora said. Someone was very frightened here once. A long time ago. She came out the other side. A pause. I find it encouraging. Sera looked at the column. So do I, she said. She found Davin standing near Ryker, the wooden wolf now tucked under his arm, watching the 3 children with an expression she recognized. The one that lived in the space between wanting something and not knowing how to ask for it. Evander, who had the social subtlety of a battering ram and twice the effectiveness, walked directly over to him. Your wolf's name is Grim, Evander said. That's good. Mine would probably be something like Crusher. Davin blinked. You haven't named yours? I don't have a carved one, Evander said. I have an actual one. Sometimes. When I feel like it. Davin stared at him. You can shift, he said. Quietly. With the particular careful hope of a boy who had been told, perhaps, that shifting was not something that came easily or naturally. That it required work and potions and pain. It's easy, Evander said, with the cheerful thoughtlessness of a child to whom it genuinely was. Then something shifted in his gray eyes. A flash of awareness, an instinct for the room that he had, Sera thought, been born with even if he hadn't finished learning to use it. I can show you sometime, he said. If you want. Davin looked at the wooden wolf in his arms. Okay, he said, very quietly. Evander nodded with the brisk efficiency of someone who had resolved a logistical question and was ready to move on, and turned back toward his mother. Ryker watched his two sons, one born to his bloodline, raised in his absence, one raised in his presence, diminished by his negligence, stand in the same space for the first time. He looked at Sera. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned away. Not with anger. Not with performance. Simply forward. The way you turned away from something that was finished. She walked back to Selim. He fell into step beside her. The children reorganized around them in their habitual loose formation. Evander slightly ahead, Brennan to the right, Isadora drifting at her own pace with silver eyes moving across the painted ceiling as though reading it. Chapter 7 in the Eastern Library, Isadora said, apparently to no one in particular. The text about convergence bloodlines. I want to finish it when we get back. We'll be at Ironmark for a week, Selim said. I know, Isadora said. I meant after. After, Selim said. Yes, we'll finish it together. Isadora nodded, satisfied, and went back to reading the ceiling. Sera looked at the hall around her, at the white columns and the orange torchlight and the 14 packs beginning to reorganize themselves into something new, and she breathed. In. Out. Forward. Chapter 13. The sun rose over Veldmore. It came up the way the sun came up in the neutral city, slowly, incrementally, light arriving in horizontal bands through the high eastern windows of the conclave hall, moving across the black granite floor like something being carefully poured. The torches had burned low. The hall had emptied sometime in the deep hours before dawn, the 14 packs dispersing to their various lodgings through the city, carrying the evening's proceedings with them like stones collected from a riverbed. Heavy, significant, changed by what had moved over them. Sera had not slept. She had sat in the hall's antechamber through the remaining hours of the night, in a chair by the low fire, not thinking exactly, more processing, the way deep water processed what fell into it, slowly and without drama. Selim had sat across from her. They had not spoken much. They hadn't needed to. The children had slept on a long bench against the far wall, tucked under traveling cloaks, arranged in the habitual configuration they'd developed in the temple. Evander on the outside, one arm flung wide. Brennan on the inside, contained and still even in sleep. Isadora between them, silver eyes closed, her breathing so quiet she might have been reading rather than dreaming. Davin had fallen asleep in a chair in the corner, the wooden wolf still in his arms, his head tipped sideways at the angle that would give him a sore neck in the morning. Sera had watched him sleep for a while. She had thought about Nadia, somewhere in the city, also not sleeping, working through the night with the particular industriousness of a woman remapping her entire understanding of her own future. She had thought about Ryker, the circlet of iron sitting on a table somewhere, the weight of it finally lifted and replaced by a different, more honest weight. She had thought about Healer Voss, writing by candlelight, the first honest document he'd produced in 5 years. She had thought about the Ashfeld Temple, its amber stillness, the pale globes floating near the library ceiling, the well in the courtyard with its mineral-bright water. And she had felt for it the way you felt for a place that had held you when you needed holding. She would go back. They would all go back. It was not a place you left permanently. It was a place you returned to. But first there was the week in Veldmore. Then the conclave session. Then Ironmark briefly, to formalize what had been informally decided. And then, and this was the part she kept returning to, in the low fire's quiet, the deciding. What came after the reckoning. What you built in the space where the wreckage had been. She heard Selim set down his cup and looked up. He was watching the first light move across the floor. His profile was lit in pale gold, the silver of his hair catching it, and he looked. Not old, exactly, though he was old beyond any measurement she found useful, but settled. A man who had made his peace with time and found that peace clarifying rather than deadening. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all questions. "I am thinking," he said, "about the well." She waited. "When you drank from it," he said, "the first night. I told you it was not for wolves." He paused. "That was not entirely accurate. I said it because I was startled. A warden does not startle easily, but you startled me." His silver eyes moved to hers. "The well responds to lineage. I had been tending it for centuries without seeing it react. The night you drank from it, the water lit from within. I could see it from the tower." A pause. "I understood then what was coming. I did not understand. All of it." "All of what?" she said. A silence that had the texture of something being considered with great care. "I told myself I was waiting for them," he said. "For the triad. For the convergence the old texts described. That was true." He looked at her. It was not the complete truth. The fire shifted, settling lower. The light from the eastern windows was strengthening, beginning to compete with it. "Selim," Sera said. "I have been alone in that temple," he said, "for longer than I told you. Longer than I told myself. I stopped measuring it at some point, because measuring it made it larger." A pause. "The night you dropped out of a window and walked through the barrens in the dark and drank from my well and pulled a knife on me." Something moved in his expression that she had learned over 5 years to read as the outward edge of something much larger held very carefully in check. "I thought, there she is. Before I knew who you were. Before I understood what you were carrying." His voice was very level. "I thought, there is the person I have been waiting for." Sera looked at him. The fire made a small sound. Somewhere outside, the city was beginning its mourning. Cartwheels on stone, a distant bell, the particular acoustic of a place waking up. "I should have said it earlier," Selim said. "I am aware of that." "You said it now," Sera said. "I did." "That's enough," she said. That's exactly enough, Selim." He looked at her with silver eyes that held, for the first time in all the years she'd known him. Nothing held back. No careful management. No ancient patience deployed as distance. Just presence. Full, unheld, honest presence. She crossed the space between their chairs. She sat on the edge of his, facing him, and she put her hands on either side of his face. A face she knew as well as anything she'd ever known. And she looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of someone marking a moment they intend to remember. Then she kissed him. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kiss of two people who had been building towards something for 5 years and had arrived at it quietly, in a chair by a low fire in the gray hours before dawn, with 4 children asleep across the room. It was warm and certain, and it tasted of the mineral-bright water of the Ashfeld well, somehow, even all this time later. When she pulled back, he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He looked young. Not physically. His face was his face, ageless in the particular way of the very old. But the expression was young. The expression of someone experiencing something for the first time, undefended, unguarded, taken completely by surprise by how much it mattered. "Mama," said Evander from the bench. Sera turned. Evander was lying exactly as he had been, arm flung wide, eyes apparently closed. But the corner of his mouth was doing something. "We're asleep," Brennan said from the inside of the pile, with his eyes also closed and his voice entirely too precise for someone actually asleep. "We have been asleep," Isadora added serenely, "for the last several minutes at least." "All of you are terrible," Sera said. Evander opened one eye. "We get it from you." She looked at her 3 children, awake, bright-eyed, doing an increasingly poor performance of sleep. And she felt the laugh come up from somewhere deep and real, and she let it out. It filled the antechamber, warm and unguarded, and the children caught it the way children caught their parents' laughter, helplessly like falling. Even Davin stirred in his corner chair. He opened his eyes and looked around, disoriented by sleep and unfamiliar space, and then found Sera's face and settled. She smiled at him. He blinked. Then, very carefully, tentatively, like someone trying something they weren't sure they were allowed, he smiled back. The formal conclave session 7 days later was, by the standards of what had preceded it, almost uneventful. The dual authority mechanism resolved as Aldra had predicted it would. Sera recognized as independently standing alpha female of the Ironmark pack, with equal authority to Ryker in matters of pack welfare and full sovereign authority in matters concerning the triad. The Conclave's Healers' Council began its review of Voss's submitted account. The force-shifting assessment was commissioned. The coalition Ryker had been calling the High Warden's Compact was formally dissolved, each of the 14 packs returning to its own recognized sovereignty. The Circlet of Iron was not mentioned in any official document. It simply disappeared. Sera suspected Aldra had something to do with that, and appreciated the discretion. Ryker signed everything that was placed before him. He did not look, by the end of the 7th day, like a man who had been defeated. He looked like a man who had been relieved of something. The distinction was visible in the set of his shoulders, the line of his jaw, the specific quality of a man who had stopped performing and could now simply stand. It was not redemption. Redemption required work he had not yet done and might not do. But it was a beginning of something, and Sera, who had learned in 5 years of temple study that beginnings were the most honest thing in the world, filed it accordingly. On the morning of the 8th day, they left for Ironmark. Ironmark Keep looked the same from the outside. The same dark stone walls. The same iron-banded gates. The same pine forest pressing in on 3 sides, black-green and dense. The same cold sky overhead, doing the same thing northern skies did in the shoulder season. Committing to neither sun nor cloud, simply existing in the gray register that felt, to people who had grown up under it, like home. Sera stood at the gates and looked at it. She had stood here before. She had stood here as a girl, first arriving as Ryker's promised mate. She had stood here as a Luna, returning from border negotiations, from pack visits, from the 1,000 small diplomatic errands that made up the practical substance of leadership. She had never stood here like this, from the outside, looking in, knowing that the person who had last left through these gates was not the person now standing at them. Evander was beside her. He was looking up at the walls with the evaluating expression of someone performing a structural assessment. "It's smaller than I thought," he said. "You've never seen it before," Sera said. "I know. I thought it would be bigger." He paused. "The temple is bigger." "The temple is very old," Selim said from her other side. "How old?" Brennan asked from behind them. "Older than the question," Selim said. Brennan considered this with the expression of someone who found imprecision aesthetically offensive, but was willing to make an exception on this occasion. Isadora was looking at the gates. "There are people inside who remember you," she said to Sera. Not a question. The quiet statement of someone reporting something they could simply read. "Several of them have been watching from the upper windows since we came over the ridge. They have been," a small pause, "hoping, for a long time." Sera looked at the upper windows. The keep looked back at her, stone and iron, old and cold and honest. She thought of the guard named Jax, who had stood outside the barred oak door and stared at his boots and said, "I'm sorry," Luna in the voice of someone who meant it completely and was powerless inside it. She thought of the women in the kitchens who had pressed a small package of food into her hand the morning of the solstice without meeting her eyes. She thought of the dozens of small, daily kindnesses that people extended when they could not extend the larger ones, when the larger ones were being withheld by a power they couldn't challenge. She had a pack. She had always had a pack. It had simply been the wrong person standing between them. "Right," Sera said. She put her hand on the gate. She pushed it open. The keep's inner courtyard was quiet in the early morning. The particular stillness of a space between the night watch ending and the day's work beginning. A fire burned in the great outdoor hearth. The smell of wood smoke and cold pine, and the particular mineral smell of old stone that she had grown up with, and then spent 5 years missing with the specific grief of something you hadn't known you'd memorized until it was gone. A figure appeared in the doorway of the main hall. Jax. He was older, 5 years older, a young wolf become a man, taller through the shoulders. He was still wearing the same style of guard's leather. He looked at her across the courtyard and went absolutely still. Then he straightened, came to attention. Not the formal military posture of a guard reporting to a superior, but the instinctive posture of someone whose body had decided before his mind that this was a person worth standing straight for. "Luna," he said. "Jax," she said. "Good morning." He stared at her, then at Selim, then at the 3 children arrayed behind her, and Davin beside them, and his expression moved through several things rapidly before settling on something that looked very much like overwhelming relief. "I told them," he said. His voice was slightly unsteady. After that night, I told the others. I said it wasn't right. I said," he stopped. "We didn't know what to do. I know, Sera said. You couldn't have done anything different that night. She looked at him steadily. You can do something different now. He nodded, swallowed, nodded again. More figures were appearing, in doorways, at windows, at the entrance to the kitchens. The keep was waking up around her, drawing toward the courtyard the way iron filed to a lodestone, the instinctive pull of a pack towards something it recognized. Evander, at her shoulder, was looking around the courtyard with those gray eyes cataloging everything. Then he looked up at her. This is ours, he said. This is ours, she said. He nodded, satisfied, as though a logistical question had been resolved. Brennan was looking at the main hall's entrance with the expression of someone already thinking 3 steps ahead. The account books, he said. Are they kept in the hall's inner chamber or the west wing? Inner chamber, Sera said. Why? Because if we've been operating under consolidated coalition terms for 5 years, the trade balances will need recalculating. He paused. I'd like to look at them. Sera looked at her 7-year-old, who wanted to examine the trade accounts. Tomorrow, she said. He accepted this. Isadora had walked to the center of the courtyard and was standing with her face turned up to the pale morning sky, silver eyes open, the way she sometimes stood in the Ashfeld temple when she was reading something in the air that the rest of them couldn't access. It's been sad here, Isadora said. For a while. But it remembers better. She lowered her chin. Looked at Sera. It'll remember better again. Sera looked at the keep around her. At the stone and iron, at the faces appearing in doorways, at the fire burning in the great outdoor hearth against the cold morning. She looked at her children. She looked at Selim, who was watching her with silver eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had arrived somewhere they intended to stay. She breathed. In. Out. Here. She had left this place 5 years ago with nothing. No plan, no allies, no future she could see past the next 10 minutes. She had left bleeding and hollow and wearing the wrong clothes for what lay ahead. She had walked through the dark and the ash-pale ground and the mineral-bright water and the long, slow warmth of a temple that had been waiting for something it couldn't name. She had come back with 3 children who carried the old power in their bones like a second skeleton. She had come back with a warden at her shoulder, watching her with eyes that had stopped being careful. She had come back with a 4th child who held a wooden wolf named Grim and was learning, incrementally, what it felt like to step down from a cushion. She had come back knowing what she was. Not the Luna title. That was a word, a designation, a shape cut into official documents. Not the alpha female standing, not the conclave recognition, not the formal dual authority. Those were the architecture of power, and they mattered, and she would use them well. But underneath all of it, simpler and more durable, a woman who had walked into a burning place and come out carrying fire instead of ash. A mother of 4. A pack of 5, counting Selim, which she intended to make official in her own time and in her own way, and without any ceremony more elaborate than a quiet evening by the Ashfeld well. Enough. More than enough. Everything. Right, Sera Ashvane said, to her keep, to her people appearing in its doorways, to her children watching her with the complete, unstudied attention of young things who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't paying attention. Let's go in. She walked through the gates of Ironmark Keep. She did not look back. Thank you so much for listening to the Barren Queen's Crown. I hope Sera's journey, from that cold examination table to the gates of home, gave you every ounce of the heartbreak and the fire and the hard-won joy it was written to carry. If her story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath in that conclave hall, or smiling in that antechamber by the dying fire, please hit the like button and subscribe to Mirabelle's Romance Library. Every one of those means the world, and helps more stories like this one find the ears they're meant for. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Who captured your heart first? Was it Selim, steady and silver-eyed and patient beyond imagining? Or did Evander steal the show the moment he called out his mother from the bench? And what did you think of Sera's judgment? Was she right to leave Nadia with her son, or would you have chosen differently? I'm Mirabelle, and I believe this. The people who throw you away are not the authors of your story. You are. See you in the next one.